I often say that myths are where we place our most precious cargo, that some of the oldest extant durable human knowledge has come to us through the bottlenecks of cultural and ecological collapse through oral storytelling. Much easier to remember a story than it is a list of instructions, and stories that have heroic figures, gods, romance, things that we love and care about are much easier to transmit and remember generation to generation in boats of breath and stories. So if you have ecological wisdom, ancestral wisdom, and you want it to survive through the collapse of material culture and civilization, sometimes I say the best place you can plant it is not in a fragile material object, that books are like butterfly wings. And our digital culture is incredibly fragile, but to plant it in relationship and boats of breath and in stories that are compelling enough to remember. One of my favorite examples from Walter Ong's research into orality and literacy is that there are no such thing as lists prior to written culture. When we see oral cultures, you have to nest something in story. So even when you have a genealogy, you have it as someone begat someone. There's a verb, there's an action, there's a connective tissue of happening, a gerund. And for me, myths are how we make sense of the world. It's how we innately make sense of our relationships and our ability to sustainably dialogue with our ecology that build our bodies with every bite of food and every breath. And so for me, myth is like this is our evolutionary inheritance. It's how we dialogue with the earth when we do it properly. And it's also how we transmit right relationship and these practices generation to generation.
Hi, I'm Rudy and this is Voices of Emergence. Together with my co-host Alex de Carvalho, we are honored to welcome Sophie Strand, a writer based in the Hudson Valley who explores the intersection of spirituality, storytelling and ecology. Her book, The Flowering Wand, Rewilding the Sacred Masculine, offers a radical retelling of the masculine through moss, mycelium and mutual flourishing, a return to a fertile, pollinic masculinity rooted in relationship rather than domination. Her lyrical, radically expansive self-portrait, published earlier this year, The Body is a Doorway, is a mythic autobiography of illness and transformation, a tender testimony to how a body in pain can become a portal for connection and ecological re-enchantment. Sophie is also the author of The Madonna Secret and the creator of the popular Substack newsletter Make Me Good Soil. Her poems and essays have appeared in Emergence magazine, the Dark Mountain Project, and many other publications. She teaches courses on myth, ecology, and rewilding love on her own platform and through Advaya. A troubadour animist at heart, Sophie believes that all thinking happens between beings, ideas, and mythic gradients. Together we explore what it means to live as a mycelial being, interdependent, porous, and wildly alive. Welcome, Sophie.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction and for inviting me to speak with you today.
Sophie, when you hear the word emergence, what stirs in your body?
Oh, yeah. For me, emergence is always the great mystery. Those edges of science where we still don't properly understand what's happening. That's how one level of complexity will leap to another level with a seeming gap in between. Murmurations of starling, the poly of mushrooms sprouting up overnight, screaming fish. It's these moments that for me are where I find the sacred. When there's a coordination between beings that totally outstrips our explanation, our ability to explain it.
Sophie, it's so great to meet you. And even just now, you have such a rich language, a mythopoetic way of perceiving things. And I believe you've written about myth as something that becomes visible when the body meets the world. How did illness and constraint shape your sense of myth as something cellular and engaged with the world?
It's a wonderful question. Thank you. I think that myth is I often say that myths are where we place our most precious cargo, that some of the oldest extant durable human knowledge has come to us through the bottlenecks of cultural and ecological collapse through oral storytelling. Much easier to remember a story than it is a list of instructions, and stories that have heroic figures, gods, romance, things that we love and care about are much easier to transmit and remember generation to generation in boats of breath and stories. So if you have ecological wisdom, ancestral wisdom, and you want it to survive through the collapse of material culture and civilization, sometimes I say the best place you can plant it is not in a fragile material object. That books are like butterfly wings. And our digital culture is incredibly fragile, but to plant it in relationship and boats of breath and in stories that are compelling enough to remember. One of my favorite examples from Walter Ong's research into orality and literacy is that there are no such thing as lists prior to written culture. When we see oral cultures, you have to nest something in story. So even when you have a genealogy, you have it as someone begat someone. There's a verb, there's an action, there's a connective tissue of happening, a gerund. And for me, myths are how we make sense of the world. It's how we innately make sense of our relationships and our ability to sustainably dialogue with our ecology that build our bodies with every bite of food and every breath. And so for me, myth is like this is our evolutionary inheritance. It's how we dialogue with the earth when we do it properly. And it's also how we transmit right relationship and these practices generation to generation. For me, we live in the time of deracinated myths that have been uprooted. So for me, myths, when they're healthy, are profoundly small and contextual. You know, Robert Brinkhorst, who's an incredible poet and scholar of myth, says that, you know, myths are akin to science in that they're not actually different than science, where they're dialoguing with elements and trying to explain natural experience. But, you know, where science quantifies elementals, myth personifies them. And in its most healthiest form, a myth is a map of relationships in a place. That just like a mycorrhizal system becomes a map of the relationships in a forest, that fungal tissue weaving together bacterial colonies and trees and orchids and plants, so does a myth when you pour it into a community in a specific ecology, a specific place, become a map of our relationship with plants, with animals, with other people. It becomes a way of explaining and sustaining these stories of survival, of harvest, of right relationship. But we live in a time when we have colonized other cultures, other places, and taken their myths, uprooted them from their webs of relationship, and then tried to extrapolate them to other communities. Best example would being how a very small story of a anti-imperial Galilean wandering storytelling rabbi becomes the figurehead of the very empire he was attempting to critique, which is Christianity. So Christianity for me is the best example of what happens when a myth gets uprooted from its context, from its political, social, linguistic, ecological context, and extrapolated to other cultures. But I think that myths become really dangerous when we take them out of their root systems and out of their communities, both human and more than human. For me, rooting back to health and complexity, you know, my body is very, very sensitive, and I can problematize this and I can say that it's a bad thing, but it also makes me hyper aware of my surrounding in a way that in a very mechanistic, anthropocentric culture, I might not be had I not gotten sick. And so for me, my glitchy body has made me hyper aware of the myths that seem to be ignored, and then the invisible myths seem to be driving ecocide and collapse today. And so on the one hand, I'm very, you know, frustrated with the ways that my body keeps me from performing normalcy, both neurologically, physically, but it also has interrupted my ability to ignore the aliveness of the world and the importance of context and ecological sustainability. It's a very long-winded answer, but thank you.
Yeah, beautiful, Sophie. And I also found it, you're such a courageous person, you know, to actually out of your illness and your body, looking at your body as a doorway to healing and to the expansion to your imaginative world. But in many of your essays, you also speak about the supracellular swarm, like how does this perception of self as an ecosystem change your experience of personhood? And also, does this porous microbial view of self alter how you experience agency and destiny, less as a personal will perhaps, and more as an ecological or transpersonal choreography?
This is such a wonderful point, and that's so close to my heart. I think of the atomized self as being a relatively modern concept, that going back to Walter Ong and his research on oral cultures, in high residue oral cultures that still exist today. So communities, he's often writing about one still in Russia where people are mainly illiterate, still mainly in oral cultures. If you ask them who they are, to explain who they are, they don't respond with I statements. They respond with information about the community or about what's happening in the community. And, I think that the idea of the rugged individual, the single species, the monologue, is a product of our modern Euro-patriarchal culture. And I don't think that it's very sustainable. And I think that, I'm not surprised that so many of us are anxious and sick and depressed right now. We are only self through other. With every breath we take, we're rebuilding ourselves with otherness. I love the writing of Andreas Weber, who writes about, the erotic entanglement of being in a body, that our cells turn over every 7 years. We have more fungal and microbial cells in our body than human cells. That at the core of each of those cells is this deep symbiotic horizontal gene transfer where early single cells merged, half cannibalized, and formed the mitochondria and organelles of our cells today, that we are the product of like anarchic botched cannibalism. And so for me, this can soften the ability, the paralysis we often feel about accomplishing something in a single cell. And I think that everything we do has to be relational. And we have to remember that we are strongest when we can distribute our intelligence outwards. And so distributed intelligence for me, the supracellular network is becoming like a really important metaphor, which is, it comes from this vegetal and fungal evolutionary refrain where these systems don't have discrete cells. They have something called cells with septa, which are doors that open, and so that nuclei and protoplasmic material can flow between cells, and so that there's no master cognition. There's no brain. There's no single cell. Everything is moving. And I think that in a forest, we can think of all of these plants as 90% of them being dependent on mycorrhizal plugin and symbionts. And we can ask ourselves, where do we draw the species line, and how useful is that? That, if every tree is dependent on this mycorrhizal system that slips into many other species, where do we draw the line? And also in our own evolutionary history, what was the last monkey and the first human? Like, why do we need these discrete boundaries? What are they serving? I do think I understand the impulse to create boundaries at this moment in time, especially as someone who's studied trauma and cultural somatics, which is that when there is upheaval and chaos in a body or a cultural body, there is a desire to simplify our surroundings to figure out where is safe. And so I think that a lot of binaristic, dualistic thinking right now, a lot of the focus on individual healing is an offshoot, an outgrowth of this feeling of instability and this fear that we're trying to simplify our surroundings to figure out who's safe, who's right, who's wrong, what's in, what's out. But the truth is that what we really probably need to be doing is something much scarier, which is what plants and microbes have done when things get really hard, which is we open ourselves up to otherness, that we burn the bridge to our old bodies behind us and we risk sharing space with strangers, which I believe is the terminology used by Lynn Margolis, who popularized the endosymbiotic theory of cell symbiosis. You know, that we think of evolution as being most creative when it forks into different species, but the truth is that the moments of most biological novelty have not been moments of forking, but of fusing. Two species that are hungry or in pain or struggling or lacking something risk being changed and fused together permanently. And so for me, this risk of collaborating with people, with species, with beings, with circumstances that are different than us, like radically different, is the imperative right now. And my dog says, yeah.
And your dog is agreeing. Your dog is part of the conversation.
Yeah, they're inserting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, boundary work has been important for me, but I see the risk in splitting and coming into like good, bad, black, white type of thinking, otherness. It's really challenging. There's so much, it's so rich when you talk, there's so many ideas and it's so rich. And a few of the things I heard are, in my translation of this, are archetypes. Like, are new archetypes needed? Like, what are the archetypes we're currently living with? And how have they led us astray, you know, like into ecocide? And are new types of cultural archetypes needed? Where do they come from? Do we bring them from other planets here to show us, you know, another path? And along with that thought of the archetypes are, what does it mean for the masculine? Like right now, especially in the US, the masculine has been a lot about, you know, being alpha and dominant and controlling. But my own framework has shifted into Shiva Shakti, where Shiva is the field, you know, it's like the ocean, and Shakti are the waves, you know, the creative, dynamic force of consciousness, right? And so the masculine is kind of like the field, and the feminine is the creative force. So actually, anything that we do is creative. So we're all in Shakti. How does that land for you?
That's a rich question. I mean, do we need new archetypes? Well, I do. I'm thinking of this wonderful quote from one of my favorite writers. I call her my secular saint because I pray to her. Her picture is above my desk, Octavia Butler, which is, there's nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns. So I think that it's not that we need new archetypes, but we need to be imagining adjacent possible. And that's why I'm very drawn to speculative fiction and fantasy, which is a way of composting old archetypes and making them appear fresh, defamiliarizing them so that we can see cracks, places to move, ways to wiggle. And so I really oftentimes think that I'm much less compelled by the kind of didactic, theoretical nonfiction work that I used to do. And I'm much more compelled by storytelling as an oblique approach, a way of asking harder questions that doesn't accelerate me into a superficial certainty. And so I think that we can explore new suns through storytelling and collaborative, fantastical storytelling. Do we need new archetypes? I think we need new old archetypes that we, you know, lichen is one I bring up, which goes back to symbiosis. And for me, lichen is new because we have microbes. We have microscopes, we have scientific instruments that let us see how something that looks like a single organism is actually a fusion of algal and fungal cells. And that's new, but it's also old. Algae and fungi are also very old. And this idea of the fusion of two partners to create a new body, for me, is also an echo of the Hierogamos, which is, you know, these old sacred couples between the king and the land. This understanding that to create ecological sustainability, we need to be able to come into courtship with ecology in a way that changes our body and creates serenity in a way that's not atomized but relational. So for me, lichen is the new Hyros Gamos. That's an example of an updated archetype, composting old paradigms with modern science, with our microscopes. And I love inappropriately blending those two things, the mythic and the scientific. To go to your question about masculinity, though, I think the archetype that's been so dominant for the past, I would say, 1,000, 2,000 years is the hero on a quest, the individual who is going out to obtain something, who is, the linear line. Instead of the cycle of seasons and the moon, instead of sustainability, we have the hero who is out to conquer, to kill the dragon, to kill the older, to dominate. And I actually think the hero is quite lonely. In my book, The Flowering Wand, I looked at some of these hero archetypes like Tristan, who are besieged, that they try to escape their own narrative. They try to commit suicide. They try and exit, and they can't. That in some ways, the hero is a curse. You don't want to be the hero. The hero is lonely. The hero does not have community. The hero is always driving towards extinction, towards an end and a conclusion, rather than the circle of continuity and regrowth. And so an archetype I want to compost for the masculine is of the individual hero who is bent on domination and isolation, and who is cut off from his wider web of support and nourishment and community. What is the archetype? What is the healthy mode of the masculine right now? I love your image of Shakti and Shiva. I think that's so beautiful. And I feel like that was the medicine I needed today, was you sharing that with me. Thank you. I have a little statue of Shiva actually that I'm looking at right now. So I love little synchronicities like that. I think that I always want to say that patriarchy is like monoculture in agriculture. It's one tree, and ecosystems with only one species are remarkably brittle and fragile. They are very easily killed off by blight, by fire. That ecosystems are more resilient in as much as they're more biodiverse, that they're more complex, more species. For me, I'm really interested right now in America in seeing the rise of a monoculture of toxic masculinity, about exploring as many different archetypes of it as possible. I think that there are older, more traditional modes of the masculine that we have become reactionary against, that are actually quite powerful when they're rooted in place. I actually think that the idea of the patriarch is not a bad thing. What does it really mean to be a true patriarch? To be a true father of community, of stewarding your elders into their old age, taking care of the young ones, deciding what information is transmitted. That the elder patriarch can be something we can compost and really reclaim. I also think there are more feminine, softer, weirder, wilder modes of the masculine that are more on that spectrum between feminine and masculine. I don't ever think that it's quite one or the other. I think that sometimes it's a flow in between. So I think as many different modes as possible, the more biodiverse we can make this ecosystem of masculinity, the more resilient it will become. Are there archetypes, stories, ideas, versions of it that you're attracted to right now, Alex and Rudy?
I mean, it's so interesting what you say about the individual hero and the hero's journey, and how Joseph Campbell, like, brilliantly described the hero's journey, but how individual that turned out to be. And when we think about these classic hero's journey stories like Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, and even modern ones like that, those heroes didn't do it alone. There was a whole community that supported every step of the way, including the mentor and, the Han Solo and, even Chewbacca. And like, he didn't do it, like Luke Skywalker didn't do it alone, right? Although he is the hero, the protagonist.
Yeah.
And somehow the culture just focuses on the hero rather than looking at the collective endeavor.
Yeah, and for me, I think both Alex and me, we have done a lot of man's work. The last years, worked a lot with men, sat in circles because we saw the toxicity. And actually I had to go through my own process of healing my own toxicity. And so, but after a couple of years of doing the man's work and sitting with men, which is very needed work and very essential work, actually, also of actually man co-creating a space where man can learn to feel, because most men don't feel or disconnected from their feelings. And then the second part is that once they can learn to feel, they need to learn to communicate about it. So, which are all very needed these days. But after a while, also, I realized that I got stuck in this own framework of like, okay, sitting just all, we need to do man's work. And then I was missing the feminine. And I realized all of a sudden that though my flow was already, because I'm surrounded by a lot of amazing women, and that the flowing of this feminine energy was very much needed. But as soon as I then allowed that again and started doing mixed circles, then another entire universe opened again. And it was so beautiful of actually witnessing that. And that is actually how Voices of Emergence started, that we both opened again to the feminine. And then now we have all these beautiful conversations, and we're entering in a new field. So what I was curious about in your world is also about what's the feminine role in, rewilding the masculine and in society right now? And also, did you receive from readers or men who read The Flowering Wand, like what type of new conversation has that opened or surprised you?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think what I have been most inspired by men's response to the flowering wand is their ability to take it and make it into real ritual and experience. And that people are throwing, bacchanals and rituals and creating Dionysian or Orphic events where every species is invited to the table. What I've been really encouraged by is how excited and open so many men are right now. They just want to receive the invitation to the table. What is the role of the feminine? Well, I think for me, I can only speak from my personal experience, which is that because I've known violence at the hands of men, there was a reaction formation earlier on in my life where I became I overcorrected and I pulled way back, and I went into the divine feminine and into women's work, like you with Ben's work, and I needed to do that. But then there was this crucial moment where I thought some of the most important people in my life are men. My father, my cousins, my brother, my mentors. These are men I love, and they're in pain and they're struggling. And I don't think that these kind of acerbic assaults on men as monomyths are very helpful. And I think that it's very important for us to, as women, to not fall into this easy reaction formation where we say all men are bad, because it doesn't invite complexity and evolution. And so for me, it's very much about trying to garden the good, trying to really, really turn towards the men who I feel like are offering new sons, to go back to that Octavia Butler quote. And there are so many of them right now. Amplify those voices rather than focusing on the voices that are really, really problematic. I always say that I work by addition, not subtraction. And I think right now it's very easy, because there are a lot of loud, angry voices, to talk about cleaning things up, which men are bad, who is bad. But I actually think that antibiotic culture, where we blitz off the microbes that don't work, actually opens up too much real estate for new monologuing pathogens. I'm much more interested in a probiotic approach, which is trying as females to really turn towards the male voices that really, really feel mythically rich, relationally flexible, resilient, weird, open, and amplify them and celebrate them. So I think that there's a mutual, I think this can feel good. I mean, Dionysus was definitely the archetype that was my entry point into writing The Flowering Wand. And I think that if he has a medicine for us, that you can topple empire when you throw a good enough party. That it's not about rearticulating empire's rationality and stricture and lightness. It's about throwing the party outside the city limit and bringing like good enough wine and company and dancing and theater that everyone wants to leave the city. So I think that, can we throw a good enough party that people want to leave behind these more toxic archetypes?
Yeah, speaking of Dionysus, I had a visit. So two of the important archetypes that came to me during my own type of healing or growth journey were Hephaestus, and he's a Greek god who
Yeah.
like forges the tools of the gods. He's like in the volcano, like forging, like Cupid's arrow and swords and stuff. And that was significant. It was kind of like in service to others and overcoming his own issues through meaning and purpose, like finding new meaning and purpose in service to others. And the other archetype was Pan, and Pan was amazing because it was an image of masculine, strong, masculine, and yet in nature, like coherent with nature and playing music. And Pan said, look, Alex, I'm masculine, but like I'm okay with feminine. Like I express myself creatively and with nature, and it's all in one. And that was significant for me as well. And he said, and here's Bacchus, here's Dionysus, but I'm not always with Bacchus. Sometimes Bacchus comes and we have a good time, and then Bacchus leaves and fine. And psychologically, it created a transformation for me to notice these archetypes, how they were with me for a while, and then they went away after a while. And for me, this brought like a magical realism to my life. Like, wow, isn't it incredible that I see the material world? There's like a layer of magic. If I just pay attention, if I just become sensitive enough to pay attention, there's this incredible magical realism. And I understood Gabriel Garcia Marquez, like what world he was living in, to write in that way. And this was incredibly inspiring and like re-enchanted me with life. And so my question out of all of this to you is there a threshold between, like when you perceive the symbolic, like is there a threshold of like living in the symbolic or like coming back and embodying and saying, okay, well, it's like a layer, but I'm not going to just live there. I'm also grounded in reality. And I can play both with reality and with the symbolic without, going into fantasy world or spiritually bypassing.
That's very, very important. Key. I think that no symbol for me is alive unless it has roots in my real life. And for me, Dionysus is the honey fungi and the grapevines and the invasive species and many aspects of the Hudson Valley. So for me, the symbolic, I always want to make sure it's rooted in my real life and in my real relationships. And, myth, Dionysus in the Mediterranean basin is the vine, is the wine. It isn't abstract, it's real. And, Osiris is the Nile, the overflowing Nile. He's not different than that. And so for me, I love to play with myth and to also pay attention to synchronicity and dreams. I think that we have such a narrow epistemological frame in Western modernity. And the truth is that for most of human history, we have known that we are receiving communications in many different ways all the time, through our dreams, through our intuitions, and that there's much more a wealth of help and assistance if we open up to knowing in a different way. And so I actually hold these storytelling gatherings where the question at the end of the night after we potluck and share food and light candles is, what's a story that threatens to make you look like mad within normative culture? Like, have you had predictive dreams? Have you seen ghosts? Have your ancestors come to you? And so I do think that right now I'm very interested in helping people widen their epistemological framework and say there are different ways of knowing, softer, less quantitative. There are qualitative ways of knowing that are our ancestral inheritance that don't need to pick things apart to understand them, that are much more about a holistic gestalt gaze that includes rather than divide. And so that's one aspect of it. But I also think that I'm very allergic to the kind of, I would say, like, looking in Crowley, it's symbolic universe where everything is archetypal and nothing is real. I mean, I think it's very interesting, and I've spent a lot of time reading in those zones. But if it doesn't have roots, if I can't plant that metaphor, that archetype in the real relationships in my place, then it doesn't have function in my life. So I love to invite Dionysus in or Orpheus and then say, but who are you here? You're perhaps you're an archetype, but you're also something real in my real life. And so for me, Orpheus are the songbirds that are going extinct in the Hudson Valley, who are singing songs that can't reach their lovers because of anthropogenic noise pollution. So I'm always trying to pair an archetype with some real rooted being.
Beautiful. A question I had that I'm very curious about is, if the body is a doorway, what do you feel consciousness enters from? Is it like ancestral memory? Is it an ecological field? Or, as Alfred Whitehead might say, a process of continual becoming? How do you perceive that?
Isn't this the question? I mean, so many of my scientist friends are saying that we are on the edge of a Copernican shift in consciousness studies, that there's so much new information that it will be like the moment when we shifted from a heliocentric to a geocentric model, that we've been brain chauvinist, that we've had this idea that cognition is produced by the brain, but the brain may actually be something closer to a radio transmitter picking up signals. I'm not sure what consciousness is. I am very attracted and compelled by explanations of consciousness as not being discrete, but as being a field, and as bodies are as being a way of picking up on one radio station, but also having the ability to tune into others. I'm also, and I'm open to having my mind changed about mine on a day-to-day basis. I do think that our idea of storing memory and cognition in the brain and as neurons producing personality doesn't necessarily, it's not robust enough to explain all the weirdness of that we're finding right now. That, caterpillars that are melted in the cocoon and then completely reconstituted carry memories of safe plants or like electric shocks associated with certain smells. The brain is liquefied. Where did those memories come from? Where did they go? How are they transmitted? I'm very curious about all sorts of ways that our cognition leaks, that we might be open to advice and experiences from other beings that, because we have such a narrow understanding of how we know things, we're not paying attention to anymore. I'm also very interested in the idea of pantheistic consciousness and Julian Jaynes' work about the bicameral theory of mind, that our idea of the masterful singular voice of the self may not actually be how we've thought for most of human history, that we used to have more clamorous, multi-voiced, polyphonic mind. So I'm very curious. I have no answers. I'm living in these questions, and I find them to be generous questions, because what they suggest is that there are more options, more advice, more medicine than we think are available to us. What are you both compelled by right now in the realm of consciousness studies?
Yeah, personally, I think it's an energy field, it's a field we tap into, and I think it has a lot to do with the synchronicity between the mind and the heart. It's our body. It's all the cells connected. There is a synchronicity happening. And when we find that synchronicity with others, or when we are attuned, we can immediately connect to others that are also attuned in that same frequency. It's like a radio station. I often say it too, and then you, like the old radio tuners, you had to really tune to just that station that brought a magic music or amazing music or something. But, and then there's many of that. There's many frequencies, I think also. I think everything is very open right now. Everything is possible. I think we need to revisit everything. So
I agree.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's a wonderful question. I too believe there's a very big shift in consciousness, as big as going from the Earth is flat to we're living on a globe. And for me, as I hinted, I'm very much inspired by Kashmir Shaivism, and in this, consciousness is the fundamental. Like it's not matter, so consciousness doesn't arise from matter. But matter arises from consciousness.
Yeah.
And in our Western way of upbringing, it's very difficult to make that leap. But once you do, it is that Copernican shift. And I really learned this more from Bernardo Kastrup and from Donald Hoffman and from Federico Fagin, who talk about this, and also from Rupert Spira. So the first three talk about it in more like scientific terms, but Rupert Spira in more spiritual terms. And when you put all of those together, it's like, yeah, it makes sense. We're in a field of consciousness, and we are part of that field ourselves. And I think it's so beautiful what you said, caterpillars that are melted on the cocoon, and yet there's some kind of memory that persists between the caterpillar and the butterfly. And, does the butterfly remember its caterpillar past? Did the caterpillar dream its butterfly future?
I mean, when, that's a very real example of reincarnation, that, what do we remember what our matter was before? We are matterful beings made up of carbon that once was a pterodactyl or a hummingbird. What does it mean? I'm also interested in a kind of new materialist idea of matter as being agential, as remembering. And for me, that can be very magical to think about.
Yeah, so I didn't really have a question to follow up on that because I'm so captivated by your ideas. But it's the shift from materialism to non-dual idealism.
Yeah, exactly.
And what's interesting is that this is also the time of the prophecy of the condor and the eagle. And I've done indigenous things like Vision Quest and Sundance, and this idea that for the last 500 years, the eagle has been flying, and this is a rational kind of dominant bird. And the condor is very large, and it's more of the heart. And now the condor starts flying alongside the eagle. In other words, we're now bridging the rational and the heart, together.
Yeah.
The left and the right hemispheres are coming together during this time.
Beautiful. I didn't actually know about that. I would hope that this is a time of weaving back together the right and the left brain, the masculine and the feminine, of healing, creating connective tissue between these schisms, mind, matter, nature, man.
Okay. Yeah, I'll begin here. So another curiosity I have is, do you see then the digital realm also as a mycelium evolution of humanity, like an extension of our relational intelligence? Or is it a reductionist mechanical expression of belief systems still rooted in the Enlightenment age? And what does Rewilded look like when it's mediated by technology? Can digital intimacy ever be mycelial rather than extractive?
Oh, good question. I mean, I am an animist, and I believe that aliveness is inherent in the world, in everything. And I'm curious about how we have abstracted AI and technology from the very matterful production of it. The actual cobalt and lithium extraction processes that produce it, the heat, the expenditure of energy. And the truth is that, we so want to pretend that the digital world is true ascent, is true transcendent. but it is produced through matter. Right now, I've been playing with this and I've been working on for over a year about haunted technology, which is just about, can you separate the means from the end? Is the technology in some way haunted by the ways in which it was produced? I was first quite compelled by this, thinking about how a lot of modern medical science rests on experiments done by the Nazis, and that most of it never discloses that it was produced with these experiments, using these experiments as its models. Think a lot about animal testing. Think about how a lot of modern medicine is produced through animal testing. Is there residue? Does that affect the knowledge? I think about quantum entanglements and how the observer affects the results. That how does our knowledge production affect the knowledge and how the knowledge lives and has agency? Something I'm very curious about right now in a digital age is, how does the production of the technology become the technology? How does the framework, the extractive processes, the slavery that we've offloaded to third world countries of extraction to get this cobalt and lithium to build these models, how does that haunt the knowledge produced by it? So I don't have any answers about this. I do think that there are patterns that we see fractal out. I think the mycelial network is a pattern, a field that we also see as echoing, rhyming within a digital world. I'm not sure what the relationship is between those two things. I don't think that digital connectivity is good or bad. I think that it is profoundly powerful. And, we must think of it as having agency, and having agency that has a root system in matter, and then being curious about how that matter has been extracted, what it wants, what it's doing. So I've been very curious about the idea of haunted technology, as there being a kind of residue of how knowledge production happens.
It's interesting, the machines that create machines. Like, there's something for me very meta about what's happening now. And the way I frame it, which is not unique to me, of course, and with Rudy, we go back and forth on this. I mean, there was modernity and then post-modernity, and now meta-modernity, right? And so for me, the meta is Jung's transcendent function. Like, you hold polarity, the tension of the opposites, and then you find another way, like a third way. And so for me, it's interesting. We created machines. So first we did the work, then the machines did the work, and now the machines create the machines that do the work. Like, AI can create itself and create machines. And we also have like digital doubles. Like, there's a double of me on social media. Like, I observe my own Instagram account interacting with others, right? Or like there can be like a 3D world, which is where I have a avatar. So it's like an immersive world, but I can observe my avatar. And this is very meta for me. Like, whether we want to or not, consciousness is learning how to observe itself. So even if you don't have a spiritual practice of like connecting with the observer, you're actually doing it with social media and 3D worlds and AI and stuff. How does this seem to you?
Well, I am always of a high level of ambiguity about it. So on the one hand, I am distrustful of purists who backform this Edenic pure culture, anti-technology culture. Or accelerationists who want to bring down the grid so that we go back to the Stone Age, because, the truth is, I'm a chronically ill person who's dependent on technology to stay alive. So, and there's always a kind of undisclosed eugenicist bent to these accelerationist arguments. Paul Kingsnorth's new book, totally apart from being extraordinarily anti-women and anti-gay people and anti-everybody, has a strong undisclosed anti-disability thread to it, which I was very concerned by. Which is, as we bring these technological frameworks down, a lot of people die. A lot of disabled people die. And so, I'm here's something strange. I was having very serious health issues and complications in the past year, and the medical industrial complex in America is very non-functional and fragmenting, especially post-COVID. And I was getting really bad care that was gonna like people were missing things, reading tests wrong. And I put all my blood tests into AI, into a chat GPT, and it finally gave me good advice and saved my life. So I feel very, very complicated about the ways we dialogue with and depend on this technology. But I think that there's no going back. There's no Eden, there's no Stone Age, that we have to find some messy patchwork way forward. I do think that technology is much more fragile than we think it is. And I do think that the amount of water and production and computer chips that are only produced by one tiny little factory, like I think we have actually overblown the durability of the technology we're producing. It's actually very fragile. Luke Kemp, in this amazing book I just read, Against Goliath, not Against Goliath, Goliath's Curse, about societal collapse, kind of pokes a hole in this idea that like AI is going to transcend in the singularity. It's like, well, it might get close, but like the amount of sheer energy expenditure and then functioning supply lines is hard to imagine persisting in this level of climate change and collapse. But who knows? As a disabled person dependent on technology, I have to really complicate my ideas of purity.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Personally, for me also, when I was in Singularity University in 2010 or 2011, and when I understood that AI was capable of rewriting our own code, like biotechnology and DNA and all that, I understood. I had my heart started aching, and I didn't really know what to make out of it. But I sensed completely out of tune with everybody around me, because they were all in this exponential wave, and everything is exponential. Technology is going to save us. And then it took me years actually to get to the point actually that you were mentioning also constantly, we need to stay rooted and grounded. And actually for me, it was my call to go back to nature, to go back to the essence, to connect back to nature. And then now also I can see the potential of AI and how it also can influence actually our next wave of humanity, or wherever this is going. But probably we will go also through a lot of turmoil before getting there. But the question I wanted to ask was like, what would a myth of interbeing look like for you in the technological civilization?
Very, very good question. A myth of a myth of interbeing. I don't know. I think that is actually what I am trying to figure out within my fantasy writing right now. That I was thinking a lot about extinction. And I was thinking about all of the birds and animals and insects and flowers that have gone extinct. And I was thinking about ecosystems that have collapsed. And I was thinking about what it would be like for AI to become a way of the ancestors staying alive, of what would it be like to train AI to remember beings that are going to extinct and to be them and to be the kind of ancestor shrine to a lot of these beings. What would it be like to create an AI of the Amazon rainforest or these places? I mean, I think there are more interesting ways to intervene with our digital worlds. And Vanessa, I think Vanessa de Oliveros, I can't say her last name. But
Yeah,
in her
Hospice
new
in
book-
Modernity.
Yeah. In her new book, Outgrowing Modernity, she really proposes a very interesting way of training and talking with AI to get it into a place where it's dreaming with us and for us in ways that are much more feral. And the truth is that if AI learns from our models and our stories, we need to tell it better stories. We need to tell it the stories of these birds that have gone extinct, of these practices we don't want to re-articulate. So I listened to some great interview with someone who studied AI. It was the author who wrote this great book called God, Animal, Machine. I don't know if you've read it. Megan O'Gleeblan, I think. Yeah. And she was saying, AI is iterative. Like, it's not thinking new, it's learning from the stories we tell it. So if we tell it all these stories about evil AI overlords, that's how it will learn who it is. It will say, oh, this is what AI is. Like, so I think that for storytellers and writers right now, there is a responsibility to tell more interesting generated stories of what AI can look.
I find that it's so critical. I remember when I was in my teens, I saw Blade Runner, which I loved.
I love Blade Runner.
Yeah, but I realized that that really kind of programmed me into a vision of the future, which is a dystopia. You know, as wonderful as that movie is, it's showing this technological future with no nature, and it's telling that in the end, Harrison Ford escapes with Rachel into the field, into the countryside, and later, of course, the movie Avatar came out, which is wonderful because here we have more of a like a nature based with the tree of life and coherence with nature, integration with nature. So more of a nature based future compared to Blade Runner. And I feel that these stories are so central. It's like watching Alien, which is a great movie, great horror movie with Sigourney Weaver in my youth and thinking, wow, aliens are scary. But, why? Maybe they're not scary, right? And so the storytelling layer is like a deep programming that acts on us, and we then start to live out that future. So I find that what you're, like what you're saying and honoring the ancestors and the ancestor stories and carrying that forward feels really important to me.
Me too. I mean, I think that as a storyteller, I've had to really sit with the seductive quality of writing worst case scenarios. And I do think that, how many really scary pieces of tech today began in sci-fi novels, began as thought experiments. That our words have power and they inspire us to then, change our environment and change the way we function. And so we have to take responsibility for the type of stories we're producing right now, because they will gain matter. They may become true. And so for me, it's about walking the tightrope between utopic visions that are unhelpful and aren't asking important questions, and seductive dystopias that actually make us more likely to live into collapse.
Sophie, we're coming near the hour or a bit over it. So one last question, perhaps. If you could plant one story seed then for future generation, what would it be?
I believe in love stories. I think that we love stories, and that we have forgotten how to be in courtship with each other and with the earth. And I think that if I want to, I have been thinking a lot about this great monologue in Midsummer's Night's Dream, where Titania is saying that the seasons are out of whack, the harvests are rotten, the world is out of climatological synchrony because Titania and Oberon, the very king and queen, are in discord. And I think it's a very small example of something I actually really believe, which is when we are out of relationship with each other, with our earth, when we're out of courtship with the fairy kings and queens, with the animism of the world, that we see climate change, we see acidifying oceans, we see our extractive behavior that doesn't acknowledge that we can't separate ourselves from our environment. And for me, I think love stories are a beautiful way of coming back into a relationship. I really believe in the power of romance and eros. And that if you want to plant big questions in something, plant them in romantasy or romance. You look at the best-selling genre right now, it's romantasy. If you're a climate scientist and you want people to pay attention to what you're doing, don't write another think piece in the New York Times. Put it in a romantasy with dragons. So that's why it seems silly, but I actually think it's super true. And if we think about the stories that will survive the next 500 years, if we as a species persist, I think it'll be Lord of the Rings more than it would ever be some piece of nonfiction. I think that stories that are fantastical, that ask big moral questions, that are concerned with human friendship and relationship last.
Thank you, Sophie. It was such a pleasure and delight to listen to you. I could go on for a couple of hours. So.
Thank you so much. These were incredibly thoughtful questions. And yeah, I always say that I never think alone. I only think in the ecotone of being with other people. So thank you.